Hi there, this is Janelle Richardson with Education 407 Technology, and this is my presentation on a flipped classroom. So basically, I wanted to show an example of how I would use a flipped classroom in my own pedagogy. First of all, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the YouTube, especially the one titled Simplifying Flipped Learning, where he described that we as educators would then be doing our lecture while they are at home through this type of screencast presentation to present the lecture material or content, and then to be able to let the students come to the classroom setting and work in group cohesiveness and collaboration, so that the teacher can be moving and helping and aiding in what he said were the more difficult tasks, what we traditionally assign as homework. So for this example, I would be focusing on the next generation science standard, which would be inheritance of traits. That's just studying the variations of inherited traits between parent and offspring, and how we get our inherited traits. So I wanted to just kind of show a brief explanation of how I would implement a 10-day unit based on human genetics. I'd be focusing on Chapter 19 in our anatomy textbook, and that would be for grades 11 and 12. And the main objective that I would be trying to define for the students is that they would be able to examine their own human genetics, traits, and alleles, and be able to apply their own life and genetics and their traits to understand where they got their traits and how that came about. So basically what I did is I would explain in a YouTube tutorial like this one that the students are going to go to a Padlet platform titled Genetics, and here's the link. The link will also be shared in the comments on this YouTube. And once they click that link, they'll come to a Padlet title page, which will look like this. And it will have the 10-day sequences for the students so that they can click on each link. If I was actually applying this to the school year, I would have the date on which those days were specified for those students. So if they were absent, they'd have access to this material. And it's just really fun. It includes a lot of different types of media literacy and video, so that the students have many types of engaging material that they can examine. And they would have mini assessments daily that we would do within the classroom setting so that they work together in collaboration, and I could be there to assist them when they had questions based on the content that they already learned through this actual tutorial or YouTube sort of screencast. Okay, so just briefly going over on day 1 and day 2, basically the objective for the students is they really need to be able to define and understand human genetics. What does that mean? What are human genetics, and how do we get inherited traits, and what does that actually entail? And how I would assess the students is I would give them a worksheet provided for the short video, which you can see here. This would be a short video titled Heredity, and it's by Crash Course Biology. It's just a really fun, engaging video that these guys put together. And so the students would be provided a worksheet. They'd have to answer the questions. I would expect that the students could answer them 100% accurately because they would be simple and straight to the point, and the video is probably geared more towards 9th and 10th grade, so I would think my 11th and 12th grade students would be able to handle those assessment. And then for the traditional anatomy textbook, what I would do catered towards flipped learning is I would actually present this material in my outline on the YouTube tutorial, and I would help the students to kind of annotate the outline of the chapter 19 so that they could really see those key points, instead of traditionally just assigning the reading and then they have to come and fill out a worksheet the next day, and who knows if they did it. So maybe this way, in a flipped classroom, they'd be able to read along with me, or they could just kind of like get the key points because I could highlight them, or I could be writing them within the outline in front of them. Okay, and then for day 3, I would present an article, and this is a great article because the link to this article actually gives them 3 different levels. So I can differentiate their learning depending on what type of proficiency level they're reading at. And this is just really great because it shows the historical background of how genetics were defined. It talks a little bit about Mendel. So the objective within this day is that the students will be able to annotate the article, and they're going to summarize each subtitle area within 1 to 2 brief sentences, just stating the main point of the section. And I would assess them by looking at their brief sentences, and did they really hit a main point of the section, declaring, a specific detail. Day 4 and 5, I really wanted to put a video because it's a different type of media, and this is actually a film. It's kind of an older film, but I think it's really applicable because it's a story about a family, and their son actually has a deadly genetic disease. It shows how the disease is inherited, so it's applicable for the students because the objective would be that they can really get a feel for how a genetic disease can affect a person, a family physically, mentally, and emotionally. And then the assessment would just be worksheet, questionnaire for the movie, so that the kids can collaborate and answer the questions about the movie together. Maybe just kind of talk about if they liked it or how would they feel if they were in that position, just to get a real life application feeling for genetic diseases and how they're inherited and how it affects our lives. So day 6, we'd actually look at some pedigree charts. So we're going to start digging into looking at these videos and understanding how recessive and dominant genes are going to be shown within a pedigree chart and how do we read them. We'll read a short article together, which I would just read that. It would take just a few minutes within the flipped learning during their home time, and then so the students should be able to read and understand pedigree charts after we go through this article and we look at this video, and they should really be able to define dominant and recessive traits within family heritage. And the assessment is within the classroom, the students would be able to answer these worksheet questions, and they can really define who was the dominant or who was the recessive carrier within this pedigree chart within the family. And then day 7, we're going to look at Punnett squares, and this is relating to the earlier articles. So we learned a little bit about Mendel. So today on day 7, what the students are going to do for their home activity is that the lecture material would be presenting how do we figure out Punnett squares? How do we figure out the probabilities of the likelihood of a gene showing up? The video is a great description of like our fruit flies and just really defining how we figure that out. So we can do some examples in front of the students at home so that when they come to the classroom setting, they're prepared to be assessed, and the students will be able to complete Punnett square equations, and they should be able to show a percentage of outcomes. I expect 90 to 100% of these mathematical equations to be accurate, and they can work collaboratively in groups, and I'd be walking around to help them. And then day 8, I just wanted to kind of make this fun. What we would do is this would be a short amount of time at home. They just look over this trait chart, look at these different traits and see what type of chin do they have. Do they have dimples? What's their earlobe look like? Just so they can kind of get a feel for what kind of traits these students have. And so the objective would be the students would be able to identify their own alleles and their own specific traits, dominant or recessive. And then the next day, the assessment would be that we would share in collaborative groups, and I'd really like them to find 3 students who have the same dominant traits and 3 students who have the same recessive traits as them. So just kind of a fun day of playing with our own traits. So day 9 and 10 are really going to wrap everything up. So going back to our main objective from the very first day, the students should be able to examine their own human genetics, traits, and alleles. So they should have a real strong understanding of what are their traits and how do we look at that through our lineage. The summative assessment, so how I would, assess the students after this 10-day period is I'd give them this performance task, which I will click on in a moment. But the performance task has 3 different types of things. The first thing is they really have to be able to define genotype and phenotype because that was clearly defined in multiple media applications. And then they also need to be able to understand what are their phenotype traits. We've discussed this actually the day prior. Are they dominant or recessive? What parent did they get that from? And then another process that they're going to do in this task is they're going to determine their genetic wheel number, and they're going to be able to compare with their classmates what type of wheel number, genotype, and phenotype they have. And then the last thing they're going to do is they're going to fill in a table to determine which parent their traits came from, and they're going to create their own pedigree chart of their family. So as you can see, I'm going to click here on this link. So I just want to go over this like I would with my students. This is what they would do during their activity during the day. So this is really great. As you can see, questions 1 and 2, we're going to really, what's the difference between phenotype and genotype? So they should really be able to know these vocabulary words by the end of the unit. And then this is really fun. You're going to go through and we are going to label our traits, right? Our phenotypes, and we're going to click an X on what genotype do they have? Do they have dimples? Do they have a tongue roll? Can they cross their thumbs on the left or the right on top? Do they have freckles? How are their earlobes attached? So this is an actual fillable PDF that they would submit to Google Classroom so that I could be able to see. And this is the genetic wheel we were talking about that the students are going to be able to fill in based on their dominant or recessive traits. So as you can see, you start in the very middle, and if you were a dominant L, then you're going to color that in. And if you were dominant, you'd go to a capital T, or the 2 lowercase t's would be recessive. And you continue throughout that until you find out what number you are on the outside wheel, and you can see how close you are to some of your classmates, which can be really fun for the students. And then they're going to just continue to fill out these questions, which they've been given plenty of information over the course of the 10-day unit. And this is really fun. They can look, do their mother or their father have it? So they can see where that dominant trait came from. And then this is the last page where they're going to actually make pedigree charts, which they have plenty of education based on those days that we looked over the pedigree information. So this is just a fun summative application where they can really analyze their own hereditary traits and be able to complete that task. And then this is kind of fun. So this is the rubric that I would be grading them on. I would give the students access to this. So I would go ahead in this flipped classroom. I would, post this YouTube link or post this video up on my Google Classroom so that the students have access to it throughout the unit. And they also have access to the 10 days. I'm just going to bounce back here so that you can see this, just the overall. So they have access to every single link. They have access to every single worksheet. I would help them, lecture them, prepare them in a flipped setting. And I think it's really exciting. Actually, I've never heard of this, and I think it's something that I would definitely want to try in my classroom. I think it saves a lot of time for kind of the lecture content, I guess, meaty part. And so that way you can have more fun in the classroom setting and work collaboratively with the students and be able to help them on the parts where we need time to help them. So anyways, that was my 10-day unit on human genetics, and I hope that you enjoyed my flipped classroom presentation.